How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Zayin, Daf 57 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, on Daf 57, we begin briefly discussing indirectly causing a mincha to become Chometz. So, for example, if you take some sourdough starter and you kind of pour it on top of the mincha and you just leave it there. You don't mix it in, you don't knead it, you just leave it there. And then it becomes Chometz over time. We then similarly discuss a scenario of indirectly causing meat to be cooked on Shabbos. What if you just take meat and place it on some coals on Shabbos and leave it there? So we'll discuss the halachis related to that. And then we discuss Chometz for minchas, nesachim, and lechem, hapanim. So we've been talking about if one of kind of the standard menachos become Chometz. What about lechem, hapanim? What about minchas, nesachim? How does Chometz relate to those menachos? Friends, this is what we have on our agenda for today. Let's jump in to Daf Nun Zayin of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we begin on Daf Nun Vav Amid Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Amr Ba'ami says, "Ba'ami niach seor al gabi isa, v'alach v'yashav lo, v'nischam tzmeileh chayav aleh k'maise shabbos." Says Reb Ami that if a person takes a mincha dough, so for example, you take a korban mincha, a minchas machvas, and there was flour there, and the flour was mixed together with water, and then you took some sourdough and you put a little bit of sourdough on top of it, and then you went to twiddle your thumbs. Yeah, have a good time. And sure enough, over time, this flour and water now becomes Chometz. So if leavening agent, some kind of a starter, was put on top of a mincha dough, and then the fellow goes to twiddle his thumbs, and the dough then became Chometz. Over time, before you knew it, you came back, oh wow, look, it's Chometz. But you weren't kneading it, you weren't mixing it, you weren't patching with it. It became Chometz on its own. Chayav, you nonetheless chayav k'maise Shabbos, just like you'd be chayav on Shabbos. Maise Shabbos ke'agavno mi mechayav. 1 second, but would you be chayav like this on Shabbos? What's an equivalent scenario on Shabbos? For example, there you have some coals, and you take a hunk of meat and you put it on the coals, and you walk away, and you come back, and you say, "Oh, something happened here, some kind of a chemical reaction." The Omar Rabbi Bar Chana says, "Omar Yechanan, hineach bas agabe yechalim, hipech bo chayiv, lipech bo potter." That says Rabbi Bar Chana, name Rabbi Yechanan, that in the scenario where one puts a hunk of meat on coals on Shabbos, he's not chayiv. He's only chayiv if he flips it over. But just taking a hunk of meat and putting it on coals and going to twiddle your thumbs, you would be potter for that. So therefore, I would say that over here, when you put the starter on the mincha dough and you go to twiddle your thumbs, you should be potter. Right? If we're comparing it to Shabbos, the equivalent case of Shabbos, putting the hunk of meat on the coals and going to twiddle your thumbs, you'll be potter for that. You have to flip it over for it to be chayiv. Well, what we're saying by the mincha is that you be chayiv by a mincha in the way that you would be chayav on Shabbos in the way that's relevant for Shabbos. Meaning, when it comes to cooking a hunk of meat, it's insufficient to just put, and we're going to discuss more about the hunk of meat in a second, but it's insufficient to just put a hunk of meat on the coals. So meaning, if you take a hunk of meat and you put it on the coals and then you walk away to twiddle your thumbs, so it's not going to cook well enough. In the case of Shabbos, you have to, at some point, flip it over and then go back to twiddling your thumbs. When it comes to cooking meat, you need that flip. So on Shabbos, you need the flip. When it comes to a mincha and it becomes chametz, you don't need to patchka with it at all. So kilu, okay, by Shabbos, you need the flip. So you put the meat on the coals, you go twiddle your thumbs, come back, flip it, go back to twiddling your thumbs, you're chayiv. When it comes to the the mincha, you don't have to flip it, so you're chayiv even without the flipping. The flipping isn't necessary in the case of the mincha, but the concept is the same. The concept is you're kind of leaving somewhere and going to twiddle your thumbs, coming back, and oh wow, something happened. Sure, when it comes to Shabbos, because of the nature of what we're dealing with, meat and coals, you have to flip it in the middle in order to be chayiv. So, okay, but when it comes to cooking on Shabbos, so that's the way that this process will have to be done in the case of cooking. But the way that this process would have to be done when it comes to leavening dough doesn't require any extra step. So even without that extra step, you'd be chayiv. But again, the concept is the same. Kind of leaving something somewhere, going to twiddle your thumbs, being chayiv. Friends, now we delve a little bit deeper into this leaving meat on the coals on Shabbos. Sugya Kufa Omer Rabba B'Chanan Rabbi Yechon Hiniach Boser Al Gabi Yecholim Hipech Bo Chayiv Lo Hipech Bo Potter. Right? We said that if a person leaves meat on coals and then goes to twiddle his thumbs, if he interrupts his thumb twiddling in order to come back and flip the meat. And he does, so he comes back and flips the meat, and then he goes back to twiddling his thumbs, and the meat gets cooked. So he's chayiv. If he doesn't come back to flip the meat, potter. Hey chidami, what exactly is the scenario here? If we're talking about, so here, this is a double negative, I'm going to positive it for you. You hear that? I'm going to positive it for you, and positive it for me too, because it's easier for me that way. That if, in order for it to cook, he needs to flip it over, then obviously if he doesn't flip it over, so then he's potter, right? Meaning if in order for him to cook it, he needs to flip it over, so if he doesn't flip it over, so he's not cooking it. Obviously he's potter then. So pshita, obviously he's potter without flipping it over. Ella de lo ma'apich le nami have a bashil, and if it's talking about a scenario where even if he doesn't flip it over, it will still cook, i.e. flipping it over is unnecessary, well then he should be chayiv even without flipping it over. Amai lo mechayiv. Why is he potter, right? When he doesn't flip it over, we say he's potter. See, that's a double negative. When he doesn't flip it over, he's potter, right? We're saying that in order for him to be chayiv, he has to flip it over. But why? Even if he doesn't flip it over, it will still cook. Lo tzricha de'i lo hipech bei have a bashil be mitzad echod. Michael ben Dusoi. Who wants to tell everybody what Michael ben Dusoi is? Apparently there was once a tough guy. His name was Ben Dusoi. Ben Dusoi was a ganef. He was always on the move because he was always being sneaky. He didn't have time to sit down and cook properly. Once it was 1/3 of the way cooked, it was cooked enough for Ben Dusai, and he would eat it. So if on one side, so again, if he doesn't flip it over, bashul mitzad echad, so then on the one side that's cooking on the coals, kimaychol Ben Dusai would be cooked 1/3 of the way, to the way that to the what's that called when you order meat and you have them cook it for you, to the how would you like your meat cooked? To what? I feel like there's a name for that. You cook it to a certain something. I don't know. How would you like your, cooking level? So like the 1/3 of the way cooked, which is how Ben Dusai cooked his meat. So if on one side it would be cooked k'Michael Ben Dusai, and if you flip it over, I guess maybe we're talking about a scenario where the coals maybe aren't that hot, I guess. Maybe. Right? Maybe right? Because if they're hot enough, then what does it mean that if on one side it would only cook to Michael Ben Dusai and then on the other side? And that's what it means is alternatively, he didn't leave it on there long enough, maybe. Whatever it is. But if it was only one side, it would only be cooked K'Michael Ben Dusai on one side, and then by flipping it over, it'll be cooked K'Michael Ben Dusai on both sides. So the Kamajman the Chol Mitzad Echod K'Michael Ben Dusai Lo Klum Hu. And what it's saying, so we're talking about a scenario where you're only cooking it 1/3 of the way through. And what we're saying is that if you take a hunk of meat and put it on some coals, and it's not and you don't flip it over. And what happens is it gets cooked on one side, K'Michael Ben Dusai. You're potter for that. But if you flip it over and it's cooked on both sides, K'Michael Ben Dusai, you're chayiv. And what it's saying is that one side of Michael Ben Dusai is potter. That is the scenario that we are talking about. Amar Rava says, Rava, V'im nitzla bo ki grogris mitzad echod b'makom echod chayiv. Says Ravi, and if there is a area the size of a grogris, the size of a dried fig, that is fully cooked, right? Not just Michael ben Drusai cooked, but fully cooked. What is it? It's Sluya Gemura, completely cooked. Does that mean 100%? I guess cooked enough that, yeah. What does it mean? Well done? But I guess cooked enough that most people, I guess, would eat it. More so than Michael ben Drusai. So, what does Rashi say? Tzliya, I don't know, maybe it's even more than that. What is it? Tosfos says, Perish, Tzliya Gemura Kol Tzorko Legamre, Yosef Michael. But then again, he says, Yosef Michael ben Dusai. I mean, some people like eating their meat really rare, right? But maybe, I guess, in order to be chayiv for bishul on Shabbos, you would have to be, I don't know, it's interesting, because Tosfos says, Yosef Michael ben Dusai. More, maybe it just means any bit more than a third. That could be. What does Rashi say? Rashi says, where was he? Tzliya Gemura. Rashi says, Tzliya Gemura, a complete. So maybe it means like, well done, like kilu, completely. In order to be chayiv for cooking on Shabbos, it has to be completely cooked. But Tosfos also says, Yosef Michael ben Dusai, which maybe means, as long as it's more than a third, maybe you'd be chayiv. But anyways, so what are we saying? Oh, so says Rave that if there is if on that hunk of meat, there is a area, the size of a dried fig that is, let's say, more than a third cooked or fully cooked, so then you would be chayiv, even though the rest is only k'maychel ben dusai. Even though we're only talking about one side, it wasn't flipped. But if there's one part that is fully cooked, so you're going to be chayiv for that. Right? It says b'makom echad. Right? Again, Amar Rav b'mnitzla boko k'grogris mitzad echad b'makom echad. In one place, chayiv. Amar Ravina Ravashi says Ravina to Ravashi b'makom echad in b'shnayim gimel makom mislo. So says Ravina to Ravashi. Wait 1 second. So Rava made clear that we're talking about if it's fully cooked in an area, in an amount the size of a dried fig in one place. But what if it's spread out? Let's say you have 2 or 3 places that add up to the size of a fig, dried fig, where it's fully cooked. Sounds like Rava would say you'd be potter for that, right? Saying dafka b'makom echad, a dried fig in one place. We learn in the Mishnah Masechta Shabbos, hakodeach kol shu chayiv. And it's somebody who drills, and he takes the smallest drill bit that he has, and it's Shabbos, and he takes the smallest drill bit that he has, and he drills one tiny little hole. Chayiv. Hechidami haso. Ilema b'makom echad kol shel ma'chazi. If we're talking about he makes just one tiny little hole, why would he be chayiv for that? Well, what are you going to use one tiny little hole for? Rather, it must be that what the Mishnah is saying is that if you drill 2 or 3 little holes next to each other that combine to make a more significantly sized hole, so then you will be chayiv. But just one little hole is not enough, but 2 or 3 holes can join together. So on the one hand, Rava is saying that when it comes to cooking, if it's fully cooked in one area the size of a dried fig, it's chayiv, but spread out, but 2 or 3 areas that combine to the size of a dried fig, you'd be potter. However, on Shabbos, it sounds like at least by drilling, we would join together smaller amounts. So lo, to which Rav Ashi responds that no, the Mishnah in Shabbos by drilling does not need to be talking about where smaller holes are joined together, where 2 or 3 smaller holes are joined together. No, you could be talking about chayiv for just one hole, just like Rava says that you're chayiv for cooking just one location. We're talking about one tiny little hole, and it's enough for a key to fit into. That they had, apparently, I don't quite understand what these were, but apparently they had kind of keys that you could stick into like a thin hole, and there was like a tooth at the end of it that would be able to open whatever needed to be open, and that was a pretty thin hole. So it's enough for that, and that is why you would be chayiv for drilling a tiny little hole on Shabbos, because it is good for something, for this key. And therefore, so Rava had said that you would have, if it's cooked in one place, the size of a dried fig, it's chayiv. And we want to say, well, isn't that against the Mishnah and Shabbos? Not necessarily. The Mishnah and Shabbos could also be talking about one place. Those who say, Rava says, that Rava says, even if it is fully cooked in 2 or 3 places that add up to the size of a groigris, you would be chayiv for cooking on Shabbos. Oh, and this is aligned with the Mishnah and Shabbos. That somebody who drills even with the smallest drill bit on Shabbos is chayiv. If we're talking about drilling in one space, what good is one tiny little hole? So rather, it must be talking about where he makes a few small little holes that join together to make a bigger hole. And we're saying that you're chayiv, and that's consistent with what Rava says, that if you cook, that it's fully cooked in 2 or 3 places that could join together the size of a grogus, you'd be chayiv. Lo, to which Rav Ashi says it's not necessarily a raya from Shabbos, because the olam b'makom echad, I could say that on Shabbos we're talking about in one location, dechazu likocha deklida, that it is, that even a tiny little hole is significant enough for a little key to get into there. So it is not necessarily for a raya for Rava, who in this version says that 2 or 3 locations can add up to create a grogeris of fully cooked meat. Okay. Gewaldig. All right, and now we're getting back in to Menachos Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis taught, Ilu nemar asher takrivu l'Hashem lo se'asu chometz. If the pasuk had only said, that which you are bringing to Hashem, that which you are offering to the Rabbanu Shalom, ensure, right, keep it pesidic, ensure that it's not chometz. Ha'isi omer einli b'loisaisa chometz l'siasa chometz elo chometz bilvad. I would think only the chometz, the part that's actually burnt, right? Asher takrivu l'Hashem lo se'asa chometz. That the chometz, the part that's actually burnt in the mizbeach, lo se'asa chometz, make sure it's pesidic. Make sure it's not chometz. Mincha minayin. How do we know that the whole mincha, if all of the flour, if any of it becomes chometz, so then you chayv for lo siyasu chometz tamalomer mincha. Right, therefore it says in the same pasuk, right? It says kol mincha shetakrivu laHashem lo siyasu chometz. So it says mincha to include the whole mincha. Shar menachos minayin. That pasuk is specifically by minchas marcheshes. How do we know that other menachos also? You have to make sure that they remain pesidic. Tamalomer, it says kol hamincha asher takrivu laHashem. Oh no, kol hamincha. It says kol hamincha, all menachos, other menachos as well, not just the minchas marcheshes. Asher takrivu laHashem, and when it says that it will be offered to God, ksheira v'lo psula. We're talking about kosher menachos, not psula menachos. If a mincha is kosher, so then you have to make sure it remains pesidic. If it's possible, then the lav does not apply. The Kanamar from here, they said hamachmitz esak sheira chayv es psula potter. That if somebody makes a kosher mincha chometz, he's chayv, but if he makes a pasul mincha chometz, he is potter. Boira Papa, we're gonna have 2 tekus now. Where Papa asks, kimtza, if a person makes a mincha chometz v'yatzas, but then he went out of the azar, so it's pasul biyotze. V'chazar, but then he came back into the azar v'chimtza, and he now bakes it, which is another step of chametzing, right? There's kneading, there's shaping, there's baking. So is he now chayiv for baking? For mechametz acher mechametz? Do we say kevan de yotzos if sila la biyotze v'chi hadar machmitz lo mechayiv Allah mishum machmitz acher machmitz? Do we say that, well, since he had already made it chametz before taking it out of the azara, so it was already pasul at the time that he took it out of the azara, which means that taking it out of the azara, it was, what did you say again? If silala, oh no. So do we say that when taking it out of the azara, he made it pasul? If silala biyotze, he made it pasul by taking it out of it, right? So he already made it chametz, then he took it out of the azara. Now by taking it out of the azara, he's making it pasul biyotze, and therefore v'chihadar machmitz lo, when he brings it back into the azara, and he makes it chametz again, but it was already pasul biyotze, lo mechayiv olim mishum mechametz acher machmitz. He's not going to be chayiv for machmitz acher machmitz because it was already, right, when he took it out of the azara, he made it pasul, and that kind of interrupts the Chometz cycle. So he's chayiv for the first time making a Chometz, but when he took it out, it was possible. By the time he made a Chometz the second time, it was already possible b'yotzei. Or perhaps we say came in the chimtza, or maybe we say that once he initially made it Chometz, it's possible yotzei lo mahani be. And therefore, Yotzei, what difference does Yotzei make? It was already possible because it's Chometz. And therefore, V'chi Hadar Machmitz La, and therefore when he makes it Chometz a second time, Yotzei is not part of the Cheshbon. It was Chometz once, he's not making a Chometz again. Mechayev La Mishum Machmitz Achar Machmitz, so he should be Chayev for Chometz twice. Teku, it's a tie. By Rav Mari asks, Chimtza B'Rosh Hashem Mizbeach Mao. What if, there's another teku, what if a person makes a mincha chometz at the top of the mizbeach? Asher takrivu amar Rachmana v'yikarva. Do we say, right, kol mincha asher takrivu, don't make chometz, and here you've already offered it. So, therefore, the prohibition against chometz is not relevant anymore. Kilu, any mincha that you will bring on the mizbeach, ensure it remains pesidic. You already brought this on the Mizbeach. So therefore, you don't need to ensure it remains pesidic anymore. Or do we say, yeah, but you may have taken it to the top of the Mizbeach if you haven't burnt it, but you haven't burnt it yet. So therefore, you'll be chayiv for Chometz. Take it. It's a tie. And now that we've learned from Kol HaMincha that it's not just the Chometz that needs to remain pesidic, but the whole mincha needs to remain pesidic. So asher takrivu lamali. So why do I need asher takrivu anymore? Asher takrivu means the part that you're going to offer in the mizbeach, the chometz. But we know that it's not just the chometz that needs to remain pesidic. The whole mincha needs to remain pesidic. So what do I do with asher takrivu, which was specifically the chometz? But we now know that it's not just the chometz; it's all of it even. So lamali, what do I do with asher takrivu? We need it like the following: B'rais asher takrivu. That when it says Asher Takrivu leRabbis minchas nesachim lechem, what's the Rabbi Yosef Glili? It says Rabbi Yosef Glili Asher Takrivu is coming to include minchas nesachim. That when you have a korban mincha that accompanies a korban minchas nesachim, so that also needs to remain pesidic. Rabbi Kiva Omer leRabbis lechem hapanim lechimutz. Rabbi Kiva says that it's coming to say that lechem hapanim, the showbreads, need to remain pesidic. Minchas nesachim may pay same. In fact, wait 1 second. How could Rabbi Yosef Glili say that minchas nesachim could possibly become chametz in the first place? Minchas nesachim would be mixed with oil, and meiperis ein machmitzin, and olive oil is meiperis, is fruit juice, and fruit juice doesn't make chametz. So how could Rabbi Yosef Glili be talking about minchas nesachim becoming chametz? How would it become chametz? It's mixed with oil. Mixing flour with oil isn't going to make chametz. Amr Rish Lakish says, Rish Lakish, Amr Hari Rabbi Yosef Glili, minchas nesachim megabla b'mayim ukshera. Says Rish Lakish that Rabbi Yosef Glili would say that a minchas nesachim can be mixed with water and it's ksher. So therefore, you can have a minchas nesachim that is mixed with water, and therefore it can become chametz. And Rabbi Yosef Glili is saying that you have to make sure that the minchas nesachim does not become chametz, that it remains pesidic. Drink a little bit more water. And we go weiter. Now we ask a question about Rabbi Akiva. Lechem hapanim. Now 1 second. We had said that according to Rabbi Akiva, lechem hapanim needs to remain pesidic. If it becomes chametz, then it's a violation of lo se'asa chametz. But midas yavishi. But 1 second. Lechem hapanim. So I looked it up earlier. I think we were talking about this. I can't remember yesterday, the day before, maybe the day before that. Shtei alechem is 2 isaruns. I believe that is 1 isarun per bread. Shtei alechem is 2 breads, 1 isarun per bread. The lechem hapanim, however, is 24 esronim, 2 isaruns per loaf of the lechem hapanim. Now, the flour of the lechem hapanim was measured in isaron measurements, but isaron measurements are dry measurements. They're flour measurements. Lechem hapanim midas yavishu. We're talking about dry measurements. V'shamayna leilu Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva, who's saying here that lechem hapanim needs to remain pesidic. But why? Lechem hapanim is being measured in isaron measuring cups, which are dry measures. And we know that Rabbi Akiva holds, V'shamayna leilu Rabbi Akiva, we're going to learn about the shita of Rabbi Akiva in about a month. The Amar that he says, Midas Yavish Lo Niskadsha, that dry measures were not anointed with the Shemen HaMishcha. They didn't become Kadosh. And therefore, the flour that was put in these Isaron measuring cups for the lechem hapanim, that flour never became Kadosh. And if it never became Kadosh, who cares if it becomes Chometz? What violation is it? It's Chulin. So Shalach Ravin, Mishmed Rabbi Yechanan, so Ravin says the name of Rabbi Yechanan, Kach I Atzoya Shal Mishnah Ve'ipuch. So it says Ravin the name of Rabbi Yechanan that you have to actually, this brisa that we quoted with Rabbi Yosef Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, you have to actually flip it around. That it's Rabbi Akiva who says that the minchas nesachim have to remain pesidic, and if they become chometz, you're over on a lav. And it's Rabbi Yosef Aglili who says that it's the lechem hapanim that need to remain pesidic, and if they become chometz, then you are over on a lav. Ashetakrivu, that when it comes to ashetakrivu l'rabos lechem hapanim, to include lechem hapanim, that's Rabbi Yosef Aglili shita. L'chimutz div Rabbi Yosef Aglili. Rabbi Akiva Omer, and says Rabbi Akiva l'rabos minchas nesachim l'chimutz, to say that minchas nesachim need to remain pesidic, that they can't become chometz. But Rabbi Yochanan the time and Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with his reasoning. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yosef Aglili, that Rabbi Yosef Aglili, who's saying over here, right? We're saying that according to Rabbi Yosef Aglili, the lechem hapanim, which is measured in isarons, in isaron measuring cups, he's saying that they are kadosh, and therefore they have to remain pesidic. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yosef Aglili, ve'echad mitamidei Rabbi Shmuel amru davar echad umanu Rabbi Yoshia, that Rabbi Yosef Aglili and Rabbi Yoshia, who is a student of Rabbi Shmuel apparently, which is interesting. But anyways, Rabbi Yosef Aglili and Rabbi Yoshia say, Desanya vayim shachem vaykadesh osam, it says by the Chanukas Mishkan vayim shachem vaykadesh osam, that everything was anointed. Rabbi Yoshia says, Rabbi Yoshia, midas halach, that when it comes to moist measures, nimshach bein mi bifnim bein mi bachutz, moist measures, like a hin, for example, so that was made kadosh, both, it was anointed and made kadosh, both on the inside of the measure as well as the outside of the measure. Midas yavesh, when it comes to dry measures like an isaron, nimshach mi bifnim, ve'en nimshach mi bachutz, it was made holy, it was nimshach inside of it, but not outside of it. Okay, sure, great, but at the end of the day, the flour for the lechem hapanim is being put inside of the isaron, and it is becoming kadosh, and therefore you have to be careful about lo se'asa chometz. Make sure it doesn't become chometz. Make sure it remains pesidic. Whereas Rabbi Yonasan Omer says, Rabbi Yonasan, midas halach nimshach mi b'fnim ve'im nimshach mi b'chutz. That it was the midas halach, the moist measures like the hin, that were anointed inside but not outside. And when it comes to the dry measures, they were not anointed whatsoever. Midas yavesh lo nimshach kol ikar was not anointed whatsoever, and therefore anything that went into the dry measures like the isaron was not made kadosh. Teidalach, and Rabbi Yonasan says, and I'll prove it to you, Sharei ein mikadeshes, I'll prove it to you that dry measures are not mikadesh, tichsiv, because the pasuk says by shtei lechem mimoshvosechem taviu lechem tnufa shtayim shnei esronim. Or when it comes to shtei lechem, you'll bring 2 isarons for the shtei lechem, 1 isaron per bread. Soles tiena, and it's soles. Now listen up. Chometz te'afene bikurim la'Hashem. That you'll bake it and then it will be bikurim la'Hashem. Emasehin la'Hashem. When do they become holy? When are they for the Rebbeinu Shalom? Achar shenefu. After they bake it. But until then, even though they've already been measured out in the isaron measuring cups, no, they aren't yet kadosh. So Rabbi Yonasan wants to prove from there the dry measures did not become holy. But Rabbi Yoshia says that they did become holy, that they were mekadesh what goes in them, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds like Rabbi Yoshia, and therefore by the lechem hapanim they have to remain pesach. If they become chometz, they are a violation of lo siafe chometz. Now, b'maikom, if we get what's the machlokas between Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yonason, but osam they argue about osam. Osam implies inside of them, not outside of them. Rabbi Yoshia savar osam lemute midas yavesh bachutz. That Rabbi Yoshia says osam, the inside of them, not the outside of them, applies to midas yavesh, whereas Rabbi Yonason savar midas yavesh cholu, whereas Rabbi Yonason says no, the dry measures are chulin, velo itztrich kra lemute ki itztrich kra lemute midas lach mibachutz, whereas Rabbi Yonason says the osam is talking about midas lach, the moist measures, the moist measuring cups like a hin, that it is holy on the inside, right? That it's kadosh on the inside, but not on the outside. And the dry measure is not kadosh at all. So 1 second, just like we said that Rabbi Yossi Agalili and Rabbi Yoshia hold the same thing, that midas yavesh is kadosh mi bifnim and midas lach is kadosh both bifnim and bachutz. So let's say that Rabbi Akiva holds the same as Rabbi Yonason, that midas yavesh is completely chol, is not kadosh, and midas lach is kadosh mi bifnim and chol mi bachutz. Mishum de lo shavu b'midas lach ladade. Well, the thing is, while they do agree when it comes to the dry measures, that the dry measures are not kadosh. However, they disagree when it comes to the moist measures. By the moist measures, Rabbi Kiva says it is kadosh on the inside and the outside, whereas Rabbi Yonason says only on the inside. Says Rabbi Papa Abaye, V'ho ika bisa dilachu. But 1 second, even according to Rabbi Kiva and according to Rabbi Yonason, when it comes to the lechem hapanim, maybe even the shtei lechem as well. But anyways, when it comes to lechem hapanim, so sure, fine. The isarun measuring cup, fine. It's a dry measuring cup, and they say that it is not kadosh, and the flour remains chulin. But you're going to take that flour, right? When it comes to lechem hapanim, you're not just putting dry flour into the oven and baking that as lechem hapanim. You are going to have to mix it. You're going to put it in a mixing bowl. That mixing bowl is a klisharis. And that mixing bowl, you're going to mix it with water, because you can make bread out of it. You're going to mix it with water. So, even if it remains chulin in the measuring cup, in the isar measuring cup, at some point it's going to be mixed with water, and there is going to be a concern about chometz, right? So, even according to Rabbi Kiva, at the end of the day, by the lechem hapanim, there is a concern about chometz, right? Even if the isarun measuring cup doesn't make it kadosh, but the mixing bowl will. So Amalei, so Abaye responds, well, you could say shalosh al gabe katavlaya, well, you could say that it was mixed on top of some kind of animal hide that was not kadosh. Yachi, if that's the case, well, then what's Rabbi Yonason's raya? Right? Rabbi Yonason had said, I'll prove it to you. Rabbi Yonason, who said that a dry measure is chulin, that the Isarin is chulin, he says, I'll prove it to you. That it says in the pasuk by shtei lechem that it only becomes kadosh la Hashem after it's baked, but not before that, not when it was measured. But can't they just say something similar? Say, what kind of raya is that? That's talking about where it wasn't measured in a proper measuring cup. Right? The Kamal Rabbi Yonason teidalach sharei ena mikadeshes lemalei. Let Rabbi Yoshia respond to Rabbi Yonason, kigon dechayla be isarin dechol. Oh yeah, the pasuk is talking about where the isarin that they used was not anointed, was not kadosh, and that is why it's only kadosh once it becomes baked and not before then. I mean, if we're already saying that, right, that we're talking about where they use non-klei sharis, well then what's Rabbi Yonason's raya anymore? Rabbi Yoshia could just say, the pasuk is talking about where it didn't use a klei sharis. Well, bishlam bisa lo kasav achmana. Bisa Kilosh la agabe katavlaya leis lanba. The thing is, the Torah never says anywhere explicitly that you're going to have to mix it in some place. It doesn't say anything about a bisa, this mixing bowl in the Torah. And therefore, we're not makbit, right? Therefore, we could say, okay, it wasn't mixed in a klisharus, so it was mixed in something else. However, Ele Isarun came the Omer Rachmana, Ovid Isarun v'chayil bei, Shavik Isarun the Kodesh v'chayil b'Isarun the Chol. When it comes to the Isarun, where the Torah talks about Esronim, what does it say? lechem tunufa shtayim shtei Esronim. The Torah talks about Isarun. And therefore, why are we, once the Torah is already talking about an Isarun, it doesn't say anything about a bisa, but an Isarun it talks about. So therefore, we're not going to say, oh yeah, we're using a chulin Isarun. No, let's use the Isarun that the Torah is talking about, which is presumably the Isarun of the Mishkan, which is Kadosh. So therefore, when it comes to the Bisa, we could say, yeah, whatever, it was an animal hide, it wasn't a klishars. But when it comes to the Isarun that the Torah talks about specifically, we're going to assume that it's talking about a proper Isarun, a Kadosh Isarun. Okay, fine. Givaldik. Okay, so be'etzem, we see that when it comes to Asher Takrivu, we said that Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that it's talking about the shtei, it's talking about the lechem hapanim. Rabbi Kiva says that it's talking about the minchas nesachim. And the reason why Rabbi Kiva can't say that it's talking about the lechem hapanim is because he says that in the dry measures, it would remain chulin. And who's to say that it ever went into a klisharis to mix it either, and therefore it is not necessarily becoming kadosh, and therefore if it becomes chometz, it's not necessarily an issue according to Rabbi Kiva if it wasn't necessarily kadosh in the first place, and it doesn't have to ever become kadosh until it's actually baked. Givaldik. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, minayin l'mayla mi besar chatos. We've seen this before. How do we know that by korban chatos, once the emurin have already been burnt in the mizbeach and the meat is eaten by the kohanim? How do we know that meat you're not allowed to burn it on the mizbeach? That if somebody puts the meat of a chatas on the mizbeach, or the meat of an ashrim, or the meat of a, clearly it's not talking about an ola, because the meat of an ola does go on the mizbeach, and it's not talking about a chatas or an ashrim because we already said it. It's talking about what are the kachei kachim, shalmei tzibur, the kivsi atzeres, mikachim kalim, or the meat of kachim kalim, which doesn't belong on the mizbeach, mimosera omer, or after the Chometz has been burnt from the omer, the leftovers of the omer, mimosa shtei lechem, or essentially the shtei lechem after the kivsi atzeres, the emurim have been burnt, lechem hapanim, or the lechem hapanim after the bazichin have been burnt, mishare menachos, or other menachos after the Chometz has been burnt. Sheu below saisi. I didn't know that if that's burnt on this mizbeach, you're over and a lo saisi. Talmud omer ki chol saor v'chol dvash. We've seen this before. Lo saktiru mimenu ishel Hashem. Don't burn mimenu ishel Hashem. Kolshu mimenu laishim. Any korban that it's a murim were already burnt on the mizbeach. Hareu bebal tatiru. Don't burn their meat or whatever their shirayim are. B'shtei lechem lechem hapanim yesh men laishim. Why are we saying that shtei lechem and lechem hapanim go on the fire? Shtei lechem and lechem hapanim are eaten by the Kohen. V'atanya yotzu shtei lechem v'lechem hapanim she'ein me'em la'ishim. That lechem hapanim and shtei lechem don't go on the mizbech. Amar v'shesh is ein migufa la'ishim. That's true. They themselves aren't burnt on the mizbech. However, by the shtei lechem, the kivsei atzeres, their emurim are burnt on the mizbech, and that's what's matir the shtei lechem to be eaten. And by lechem hapanim, the bazichin are burnt on the mizbech, and then that is what's matir them to be eaten. So even though they themselves aren't being burnt on the mizbeach, but there is, whether it's the bazichin or the kivsei atzeres, that are burnt on the mizbeach as part of their offering, but the shtei lechem, the lechem hapanim themselves are not burnt on the mizbeach. Friends, that was Daf Nun Zayin of Masechta Menachos. Friends, on Daf Nun Zayin we learned about indirectly causing a mincha to become chometz, meaning if you have the dough of a korban mincha and some starter is just left there on it, and now the dough becomes chometz, you are going to be chayiv for that. We discussed indirectly causing meat to be cooked on Shabbos, meaning, what does indirectly mean? It means that you take the meat and you just kind of leave it there. You put the meat down and you leave it there. So we say that if it gets cooked at least the size of a dried fig, you are going to be chayiv for cooking, even if you didn't flip it over or anything. If you leave the meat there and it cooks over time, you're going to be chayiv for cooking on Shabbos if it cooked at least the size of a dried fig. There was a question about what if it's cooked the size of a dried, in 2 or 3 places, less than the size of a dried fig, but it adds up to the size of a dried fig. Are you chayiv or not? First Rava said you'd be potter, then Rava said you'd be chayiv. So this is a little bit unclear there. Now, if it gets cooked to the amount of Michael ben Drusai, about 1/3 of the way cooked on just one side, you're going to be potter. But if you then flip it over and now it's cooked on Michael ben Drusai on 2 sides, you're going to be chayiv for cooking. And it goes without saying that if it's simply not cooked at all, you're going to be potter. And then we discussed a chometz. No, not a chometz. Chometz, when it comes to, I should probably be spelling that with an A rather than an O. Chometz for minchas, nesachim, and lechem, hapanim. When it comes to minchas, nesachim, Reb Akiva says that you are going to be chayiv if the minchas, nesachim is mixed with water and becomes chometz, in violation of lo se'oseh chometz. And when it comes to lechem, hapanim, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that you will be chayiv if the lechem, hapanim becomes chometz, and that, of course, got into a little question about, well, the lechem hapanim is measured in isar and measuring cups. Do isar and measuring cups become? Did they become kadosh, and therefore do they make their contents kadosh? That was a machlekes between Rabbi Yoshia, who says that yes, dry measures, the inside of them are kadosh, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili agrees with Rabbi Yoshia there, and Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbi Yonason, who says that dry measures are not mekadesh what is in them. They do, however, disagree when it comes to moist measures. Rabbi Yonason says that moist measures are mekadesh only things that are in them. Rabbi Akiva says even from the outside they're kadosh as well. Friends, that was Daf Nun Zayin of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.